So, Layer Cake is the 2004 crime thriller directed by Matthew Vaughn in his directorial debut. And on the surface at least, this is a pretty disposable film, but when you peel back the layers, there's actually loads going on here. This film is about sophistry, the gentrification of crime. It is a very subtle study of the British class system, and it is very deliberately the anti-Get Carter film. And since this is my first video on this brand new channel, be aware, dear viewer, that I don't ever script a video. And just like my other channel, this is entirely my personal view. Now that's out of the way, let's get on with the video. So to begin to understand this film, we need to look at the main character. He's never actually named in the film, he's just credited as Mr. X, but he's played brilliantly by Daniel Craig. And he starts the film off with this opening monologue, and it's very cleverly written. What he basically states is this: when bank robbers, for instance, and gangsters were locked up with hippies that were serving 12 months in prison for importing over £1 million worth of drugs, when they themselves were in prison for 15 years for robbing a bank of £10,000, leading them to believe that they were in the wrong game. And he then goes on to argue that, don't worry, because one day in the future, people like him won't be needed, because all this will be legal. And I say this is cleverly written because, well, you're compelled to agree with the narrator at this point, because he's doing two things here. He's giving you a fact, a historical, unarguable fact about the gangsters in the 60s, and then what he does is he presents the notion that drugs will be legalised without offering any argument to back up his case. This is a lie that he's told himself so often that it has become a truth, at least as far as he's concerned. He then goes on to explain just where he sits in the layer cake, what his attitude is, and how he views the criminal world in which he inhabits. And it's from this we learn that he doesn't actually see himself as part of the criminal world. He sees himself as a businessman who just happens to deal in drugs. All he wants to do is nip in and out and make a quick million out of it. And he relies on his business associates, who just happen to be career criminals, to engage with that murky world for him. So from the very beginning, this man is utterly deluded and dangerously naive. As far as he is concerned, he is just gentrifying crime. At worst, he is just morally ambiguous. And as a viewer, you're pulled along with this. You're pulled along with all these lies, and you believe this guy as much as he believes himself. Mr. X thinks he can keep himself clean. He thinks he can control crime like a system, again demonstrating his naivety. And you could argue that this is yet another lie that he's telling himself as a means of avoiding any sort of guilt that he might feel for the absolute chaos and destruction that his line of work brings to society. But at the same time, I don't think he's got enough self-awareness for that, because if you look at his interactions with the senior gangsters, Mr. X is supremely arrogant. He fails to comprehend the sheer level of violence they can bring to him, and he steadfastly refuses to acknowledge their intelligence. And that's possibly his biggest mistake. All he respects about these men is their power. He sees them as corporate bosses, because of course, what does he care? He's going to be out of this soon. He's nearly made his million. I mean, don't get me wrong, these men are portrayed as absolute dinosaurs, and they also lie to themselves as much as Mr. X does, holding the belief that because they are a few steps removed from the criminality, they no longer bear any responsibility for its consequences. Yet more lies, hidden behind very clever arguments. And that is one of the key themes in this film, that if you keep telling yourself the lies, they become a truth. And when I say everybody, I mean everybody, with the possible exception of Tammy, who I will get to, trust me. But from the very top, Eddie Temple convincing himself that he is now completely legit and has finally shaken off his working class roots and is now a fully fledged member of the establishment, down through Mr. X, who's convinced that he's just a legitimate businessman, down to the bottom of the rung, the Duke himself, a grade A fantasist surrounded with fantasists, convinced that he's a big shot gangster, when in truth and almost pathetically, he's just a chavvy council estate hooligan. And Mr. X is so far into this delusion that he's just a businessman that when he has to deal with these people, he's almost holding his nose as he's doing it. As I mentioned, his arrogance prevents him showing any respect to these old boys, and we see that in the lunch scene with Jimmy Price, because in this moment, he's in the belly of the beast. Morty, Jimmy and Jerry are the three gangsters in the room. Or at least as far as Mr. X is concerned, because he don't call himself a gangster, he's a businessman. But because Jerry and Morty have seen the violence and seen the chaos and have seen the sheer power that Jimmy holds, they show him respect. And Mr. X can't bring himself to do it. He just sits there with an attitude on, like he's above all of this. He just wants to get through all of the bullshit and down to the business. Because, again, he's a businessman, he's not a gangster. Or so he tells himself. But there's also a lot of subtle class tension going on in that room as well. For instance, there's a moment where Jimmy poses the question, what do you want out of all this, Mr. X? Because in his eyes, Jimmy is just using big words to sound clever. So he smarmily answers that is a very expansive question, possibly reasoning to himself that a man of Jimmy's background uses these big words but doesn't have any comprehension of them, so I'll show him. I'll use big words and make him feel right out of his depth. And in that moment, restoring what is in his mind the correct hierarchy in that room. And he does this again later on when Eddie Temple's got him up on the roof. Because as I say, everybody's lying to themselves in this film, and in this particular moment, Eddie Temple thinks that he's going to dominate him with his intellect, and that this power that he has over Mr. X at this point has nothing at all to do with the fact that his two henchmen have just tried to throw him off of a roof. And Eddie asks him, do you know what a remora fish is? And at this moment, Mr. X has finally cracked and he's completely lost his cool, because now he has finally seen the crap that he has got himself into, and that he has been sucked into this world and he can't escape it, at least not for now. So he snaps and he's just like, with a load of attitude, yes, I know what a remora fish is, can we get down to business? And that's actually a really interesting scene, because as far as I can make out, there's some really clever things happening in the background there. Firstly, it's tying into that really working class belief that the banks, well, they're just gangsters that went legit. So by placing this scene in Canary Wharf, which is London's second financial district, and having this gangster that thinks he's some sort of businessman building his own tower there, well, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? And then it cuts straight into this image of Daniel Craig's character being taken down in this big lift, and this lift looks like a cage. It's almost like Mr. X is being dragged straight down into hell. So this is all one layer of the cake, the lying and the sophistry. But what about the other layers? As I mentioned a moment ago, this film is also about the gentrification of crime. Mr. X sees this as a business. Eddie Temple sees it as a business. Jimmy Price less so, and for the career gangsters, they don't see it like that at all. Mr. X just wants to make his million, yet he still deludes himself into thinking that he's not doing any real harm. It's a money-making scheme alongside his letting agency. If Mr. X was still alive, he'd be a Shoreditch hipster. And it's only when the system that he has built starts to collapse that he really starts to understand just why these people do what they do. And their reason for doing what they do, well, they all come from grinding poverty. And for these people, it's their only marketable skill. And Mr. X is blindsided by that. This was something he just couldn't comprehend from his position. Again, with the naivety And this fact that Mr. X is nothing but a tourist, really, in this world, is brought, for me at least, into very sharp focus during the cafe scene, when Morty absolutely loses it when a former associate of his walks into the cafe, and it transpires that this associate is the man directly responsible for Morty spending 10 years in prison. It's very subtle in this scene, but Mr. X here is the least streetwise gangster I have ever seen in a film. Because, to start off with, he cowers in the corner. If Mr. X had been from that world, he would have joined in. The second thing he does, which, to be honest with you, if he was streetwise at all, he would have learned at school, he uses Morty's name. He says, "Morty, stop it, he's had enough," like in front of a witness as well. And thirdly, in a later scene, it has to be explained to him that in the eyes of the law, he's either going to have to testify against Morty or he's going to be in the dock with him. And there again, he's not concerned with having to testify against Morty out of any sense of loyalty. He just knows that if he does testify against him, well, Morty's got friends that'll stop that from happening. This is all tying into the naivety angle, which I was discussing earlier on. But it's also highlighting the fact that this man thinks that he can control crime. He can keep his nose out of it. He can gentrify it. When in actual fact, he really can't. Because this is an utterly chaotic and violent world that he is completely unqualified to be part of. He's just too self-deluded and arrogant to believe otherwise. This in itself is yet another theme that runs through this film, because their world is so chaotic and so violent that none of them are truly qualified for it. Starting out at the bottom with the Duke, he's just a fantasist out to make a reputation for himself. He is completely inept. He's blissfully unaware that he's being manipulated by Jimmy. He's totally unprofessional. They don't even know where the robbery is going to take place. When they arrive there to do the robbery, they don't even know exactly how many pills they're going to be able to steal. And when they arrive in the UK, they don't even know the value of the pills they have stolen. They think they're worth £5 million. They don't even have a buyer set up for them, and they're completely unaware of the logistics involved in this. So when Mr. X goes down there and tries to explain to them that these pills ain't worth £5 million, they think they're being swindled by him. And credit where credit is due here, because Slasher, she's the only one in that scene who calls Mr. X for exactly what it is, because she points straight at Mr. X and calls him a yuppie. And then there's the middlemen. They're supposed to be career criminals. They fail to spot the fact that there's a grass amongst them. This should be a sixth sense to these people, but because they are so in awe of Jimmy Price and are so loyal to him, because they're old school, they fail to spot it. But what about the very top of the ladder? What about Eddie Temple? On the face of it, he's very qualified. He has clawed himself out of the grinding poverty of his childhood, and now he is fully legit. He is a proper businessman. He has even managed to marry himself into the aristocracy through wit and guile and more than a little bit of ultra-violence. He has gone from being a street thug to a fully paid up member of the establishment. He's there, he's made it, and he is deeply insecure. You can see this from, as I mentioned earlier, the lies he tells to himself. He says to Mr. X that he invites Jimmy down to golf tournaments and things, because as we are shown, Jimmy is so laughably working class that all of his friends see him as absurdly funny. But Eddie's being really clever here, and he's also telling another porky, because what's happening is twofold. Firstly, those people laughing at Jimmy are doing just that. They're laughing at Jimmy, not with Jimmy. They see him as a clown. And on the other hand, by bringing Jimmy to these events where he can be laughed at for being so shamelessly working class, Eddie thinks this makes him look even more sophisticated. The logic being that Jimmy's lack of refinement is so enormous and comical that it will disguise Eddie's lack of refinement. So we have even more dishonesty, more lies. Because let's have it right, they can probably all see through Eddie and that thin veneer of refinement he's got. And this is highlighted again when Mr. X and Eddie first encounter each other. Now on the surface, this just looks like Eddie trying to assert dominance with his intellect. But let's look at that a little bit more closely, because there is no need for Eddie to do that. He is in complete control. He has his 2 henchmen with him, and Mr. X is absolutely terrified. Eddie is in complete control of that situation already, but because he's so insecure, he can't see it. And it's because Mr. X is middle class, so he feels that straight away he must dominate Mr. X intellectually, because otherwise it'll be a catastrophe. Mr. X won't take him seriously. He'll see him for what he is, yet another working class hooligan. So he makes the comment about the remora fish, and that's him basically saying, hey, I'm as clever as you are, so in one sense I'm as refined as you are. As this encounter progresses and they're sitting in Eddie's Bentley, which by the way in 2004 had a bit of a new money kind of image, Eddie's taking Mr. X back home after letting him know that Jimmy's a grass. And Eddie's all relaxed now, because now he feels like he's in control and he's asserted his dominance. And Mr. X is sat there all humble, feeling like he's dealing with one of his superiors. But Eddie's lack of refinement still finds a way to seep out. So if you listen to the conversation they're having, on the surface at least, it seems like Eddie's making a bit of a sick joke when he tells him about going to the opera that evening and just what opera he's about to see. But this isn't the case. Again, this is Eddie's lack of refinement coming through, because Eddie makes a mistake here, and anybody with any real class will see straight through him. He mentions that he's going home to freshen up because later on that evening he's got tickets to the opera, and then he tells Mr. X he's going to see The Damnation of Faust, and he briefly mentions just what this opera is about. If Eddie was as refined as he makes out, he wouldn't have bothered with the explanation, because really wealthy people, when they talk to each other and they say things like, I'm going to see The Damnation of Faust tonight, they won't bother telling the other person what it's about, because they just assume the other person knows what it's about. It's a very subtle piece of characterisation going on there. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to make out that Eddie sat there with all the refinement of the Lord of the Manor. He's still sitting there effing and blinding, but he's effing and blinding in a way that a wealthy old businessman would eff and blind, not a dangerous psychopathic gangster. And it's all because he's trying to convince himself that he is something he's not, and he's desperate for everybody around him to go along with it. But one of the subtle things about Eddie was the makeup they put him in. He's got a really bad fake tan. The fake tan is so bad it looks grubby, and this is really highlighted in the warehouse scene, because in this scene Eddie's dropped all the pretences. He's a gangster again, and he's a gangster that's giving a pseudo-intellectual speech about climbing up the ladder, and that's a speech that at first glance seems quite profound, but it doesn't actually bear close inspection. But if you look closely at Eddie here, the way he's lit, the way he's half in shadow, and that fake tan of his looking really grubby, and the way he's got no tie on or anything, talking almost in his original working class voice, we see Eddie for what he is. He's a scruffy old gangster. From beginning to end, that's all he is, and that's all he ever will be, despite all the airs and graces he puts on. And it is for his insecurities that I make the argument that Eddie, well, he's not qualified neither. Could you imagine an American mafia don, for instance, really caring about all that sort of stuff? Because they're not insecure like that. They know they're already dominating him, they're dominating him physically, and they already know they're smarter than him as well, because the way they see it, if he was the clever one, it'd be them that's being thrown off the building. So, yes, this film is all about dishonesty, it's all about sophistry, and it's all very subtle. It's also about class, and it's also answering the question as to why these people do what they do. We get that answer through the lens of Mr. X's naivety. Now, I also stated at the beginning of this video that I think that this film is the anti-Get Carter film. So, Jack Carter, brought to life by Michael Caine, my favourite actor. He does what he does out of a sense of honour. He is on a suicide crazy mission of revenge. He is ice cold, and despite the fact that he's got an escape plan of sorts, he knows deep down that he's never going to get away. That chaos and violence that Mr. X thinks that he can simply keep at arm's length, well, that's Jack's world. That's all he's ever known, and he's indifferent to it. That chaos and violence and destruction, he sees it as something that he can control and harness and earn a fortune from. He doesn't like violence, and he states quite clearly that he hates guns. These are two very opposing philosophies. We also have two films where, on the one hand, we have a very modern, very sleek film set in a very trendy and cosmopolitan London, where the consequences to their criminality, and when I say consequences, I mean the social consequences, we get to see the end user like once or twice throughout the film. Whereas Get Carter, those consequences are in your face from the very beginning. So, yes, in a way this is the anti-Get Carter film, but at the same time, and I would argue very deliberately, when all is said and done, both films carry the same message, because both Mr. X and Jack Carter, ultimately, for all their heroics, they are brutally and violently gunned down. So what Layer Cake is saying is this: you can try and gentrify crime, you can lie to yourself as much as you want, you can be in a state of complete denial of who you are and where you came from and what you do, but the reality is still the same, and the outcome will still be the same. This is not a world you can simply leave. So the only way to win the game, well, is not to play it. And that simple message is the same throughout both films. Anyway, this is just my personal view on the film. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. And if you like my video, consider hitting the like button. And if you really liked it, hit the subscribe button.